In this lesson, we are going to take the factoring practice test part C. Before we start this, I need to remind you about the chart that lets you know how you know when you're supposed to do what method of factoring. So step one is always to factor out the greatest common factor. And then step two is to identify your number of terms. So if you have two terms, it would either be the sum or difference of squares or the sum or difference of cubes. 3 terms would be the AC method, and then 4 terms would be grouping. So I recommend writing this chart down so you can use it, and it'll be handy for you in the lesson. So on number 1, I have 8r to the third minus 64r squared plus r minus 8. There are 4 terms here, and in our chart it tells us that 4 terms is grouping. So that's when you take the greatest common factor out 3 different times. So I'm going to take the greatest common factor of these first 2 terms out and the greatest common factor of those second 2 terms out. So my greatest common factor here would be 8r squared, which would leave me with r minus 8. And then over here, well, there isn't anything they have in common, but you have to write something. So we're going to write a 1. We're just going to pull it out because that won't change anything. And that would leave us with an r minus 8 in those parentheses. Since we have the same thing inside of these parentheses, we know we're on the right track. So I'm going to pull out an r minus 8. And when I do so, I will be left with 8r squared plus 1. So we are now finished with factoring by grouping on that one problem. Now number 2, step 1 is to take out the greatest common factor. When we look at number 2, we will see that there is no greatest common factor. So we now have to look at the number of terms. There are 3 terms, so that's our AC method. So you identify your A, your B, and your C. I'll remind you of the little formula I gave you guys, ax squared plus bx plus c. This tells you that the number in front of x squared is always your A, so that answer is a 1 there. The number in front of your x is always your B, so that would be a negative 12. And then the number by itself at the end here is your C, which would be a positive 14. So we need to find out what 2 numbers multiply to give us 14 and add to give us negative 12. So remember, A times C goes up here to give you that 14, and your B goes down here to give you that negative 12. So I'm going to write out my factors of 14. So I've got 1 and 14, and then 2 and 7. So there are no 2 pairs here that will add to give you a 12, a negative 12. So that means this problem is prime. On number 3, there is no greatest common factor, so I look at my terms. I have 2 terms. It is the sum of squares, and we know the sum of squares is always prime. Doesn't normally happen this way where we get 2 prime problems in a row, but that's how it happened this time. Number 4, I've got x cubed plus 125. There is no greatest common factor, so I'm going to look and see how many terms I have. There are 2 terms. So I look and see it's the sum of cubes. So that means it's the car bus method. So you draw your car and your bigger bus. So it's same, opposite, always positive. So you started out with the plus sign, so we're going to continue with the plus sign because it's got to be the same. The opposite would be a minus, and then you have this last one to be always positive. So now we have to find out what times itself 3 times gives me x to the third, The answer is x. And then what times itself 3 times gives me 125? And that answer is 5. So now it's square multiply square. So you square this first term to get x squared. Multiply these two terms together to get 5x. And then you square this last term to get 25. We are finished. So on number 5, this problem is our difference of squares problem. So it's a car problem. So I always have the happy car and the sad car, or the good car and the bad car. So the front seat and the back seat. So what times itself gives me 4x squared? The answer is 2x. And then what times itself gives me 144y squared? The answer is 12y. And we are finished. Number 6. Step 1 is to take out the greatest common factor. There is no factor that all of these have in common, but you do have to take out a greatest common factor of -1, because you cannot have that first term, your leading coefficient, to be a negative. So that leaves me with x squared minus 21x plus 7. Now you identify your number of terms inside of that set of parentheses, and you identify your a, b, and c. A is 1, b is -21, c is 7. So we want to find out what multiplies to give us 7 and adds to give us -21. Well, the only factors of 7 are 1 and 7, and you can't possibly add those together to get a -21. So that means that this right here would be our answer, because we had to take out that -1, so that was a greatest common factor. So, oops. So that's our final answer. Number 7, step 1 is to take out your greatest common factor. Greatest common factor is 3. So when you take that out, you're left with 4x squared plus 4x minus 3. Now you're going to have to take the inside of the parentheses and determine how many terms are in there. There are 3 terms, so that means that would be our AC method. So our A is 4, our B is -3, I'm sorry, our B is 4, I'm so sorry. And our C is -3. So A is 4, B is 4, C is -3. So I put a 4x on top of my wings. A times C goes in this top portion here, so it would be -12. And then B goes down here, which is 4. So I need to find out what multiplies to give us -12 and adds to give us a 4. So I've got 1 and 12, 2 and 6, and 3 and 4. So I'm going to use 2 and 6. And your bigger number is going to take the sign of whatever your B is. So since our B is positive, that means the 6 has to be positive, which makes that 2 negative. So I've got a -2 here and a 6 here. So before I can write out my answer, I have to simplify these two numbers in my fraction. So that's a 2 here, and then that's a 1 here. This is a 2 here and a 3 here. So one thing I will caution you on is don't forget this 3 here has to be a part of your answer, and it just goes in front of the parentheses. And then we have 2x minus 1, and then we have 2x plus 3. And then we're finished. Number 8, step 1 is to take out the greatest common factor. So the greatest common factor is a 13b squared. So these 13s would cancel. If you've got 3 b's and you take 2 away, you're left with 1 b. 26 divided by 13 is 2. B squareds will cancel. Now you look at the inside of your parentheses. It's the sum, but we don't have perfect squares or cubes on either side. So that means this is our final answer. Number 9, step 1 is to take out the greatest common factor. So there isn't one here. So then we need to identify the number of terms. You have 2 terms, and it's the difference of cubes. So that means we're going to use our car and bus problem. So to find out what our signs are, we use SOAP. Same, opposite, always positive. So you started off with a negative, so you're going to have a negative for the same. You do the opposite here to make this a positive, and then this is always positive. So now you do cube root, cube root. So what times itself 3 times gives me 8x to the third? The answer is 2x. What times itself 3 times gives me 1? The answer is 1. So now you square, multiply, square. So you square that 2x, which means 2x times 2x, which is 4x squared. Then you multiply these 2 terms together to get a 2x. And then you square that last term to get a 1. And you are finished. On number 10, step 1 is to take out your greatest common factor. So our greatest common factor here would be a 3x. So I can pull out that 3x and I'm left with 2x squared minus 3x minus 5. So then you look inside of your set of parentheses and see what else can I factor. So I have an A, B, and C. I know to use the AC method because there are 3 terms inside. My A is 2, B is -3, C is -5. You draw out your X. On top you put your 2X. Up here, your A times C, which is -10. Down here, your B, which is -3. So I need to find out what multiplies to give us -10 and adds to give us a -3. So my factors I'm going to use are 2 and 5. And since I have to choose which one is which, remember your bigger number always takes whatever your B sign is. So since this is a negative for our B, that means our bigger number has to be negative. So it gives us a 2 and a -5. So these 2's are going to cancel out, leaving you with 1's. So I have x plus 1 and then 2x minus 5. I didn't simplify this because 2 and 5 don't simplify. But don't forget you've got that 3x you took out there, so make sure you put that in your answer space. Number 11, step 1 is to take out the greatest common factor. So my greatest common factor here would be -7. Can't take, and -7b squared, sorry about that. Can't take out any a's because this is the only term that has a's. You can't take out any c's because this is the only term that has c's. So now you divide each of those terms by a -7b squared. So I'm left with b squared minus 4ab plus c. Got that because the negative 7 divided by negative 7 is a positive 1. To have 4 b's, you take 2 away, you're left with 2 b's. 28 divided by negative 7 is negative 4. You didn't take any a's out, so that a comes down. You have 3 b's, you take 2 away, so you're left with 1. Those negative 7's are going to cancel. Your b's are going to cancel, leaving you with just that c. Now you look at the inside of your set of parentheses and say, okay, well, can I factor? There are 3 terms, but it is not in the form of ax squared plus bx plus c, so we're finished. Number 12, step 1 is to take out your greatest common factor. Since there is not a greatest common factor, we are going to look at how many terms we have. There are 3 terms, so we are going to use our AC method. A is 5, B is 19, and C is 12. So up top I have a 5x. Up here, A times C gives you 60. Down here is your B, which is 19. So I need to find out what multiplies to give me 60 and adds to give me 19. So the numbers I'm going to use here are 4 and 15 because those are the ones that will add to give me 19. And then you can simplify this fraction to be a 1 and a 3. So I'm left with 5x plus 4 times x plus 3. On number 13, you notice that you have 4 terms there. So that is our grouping method. Our grouping method, we are going to underline our first 2 terms and then our second 2 terms. So take your greatest common factor of these first 2 terms. I can take out a 5m, which leaves me with 2m minus 3n. And over here I can take out a 2n, which leaves me with a 2m minus 3n. We have the same thing in both of our sets of parentheses, so we know we're on the right track. So I can pull out a 2m minus 3n, and I'm left with that 5m plus 2n. On number 14, we have 2 terms. There is no greatest common factor, and it's the sum of squares. We know that the sum of squares is always prime. But on number 15, notice that these 2 problems are very similar. The only difference is the sign that connects them. Well, since this is the difference of squares, we can factor that. It's a car-car problem. You have a good car, you have a bad car. So front seat and back seat. So what times itself gives you x squared? The answer is x. What times itself gives you 25? The answer is 5. Moving on to the last page of the practice test. So on number 16, I have to first see what can I pull out of there. What is my greatest common factor? There is no greatest common factor, so I'm going to identify my number of terms. I have 3 terms, so it's my AC method. So my x's go on top of my wings. A times C is 64, B is 16. So I have to find out what numbers multiply to give me 64 and add to give me 16. So 8 and 8 are the numbers I'm going to use. So I have x plus 8 times x plus 8. The only other answer I would have accepted here is if you wrote x plus 8 squared. That would also be fine. Number 17, you'll see this problem is a grouping problem. So you underline your first two terms and then you underline your second two terms. Well, I can take an x out of my first two terms to give us x minus 2. And I can take a negative 3 out of my next two terms, which gives me an x minus 2. We know we are on the right track because we have the same thing inside of each set of parentheses. So I pull out an x minus 2. When I do that, I'm left with x minus 3. We're finished. On number 18, step 1 is to take out your greatest common factor. Since there is no greatest common factor, that means we're going to identify our number of terms. There are 3 terms, so that means our AC method. So I set up my x by putting 6 x's on top of my wings. And then A times C goes up here, and B goes down here. So I need to find out what multiplies to give me negative 36 and adds to give me a 5. So 4 and 9, and I know that one number has to be positive and one number has to be negative in order to get a negative 36 for a product. Our bigger number is going to take whatever sign our B is, so since B is a positive 5, 9 will be positive, which makes my 4 negative. Now I have to simplify my fractions. So the 6 and the negative 4 will simplify to be a 3 and a 2. The 6 and 9 will break down to be a 2 and a 3. So my final answer here is going to be 3x minus 2 and then 2x plus 3. Now number 19. Step 1 is to take out your greatest common factor. Since there isn't one, you have to identify your number of terms. So I have 2 terms here, x to the 3rd and an 8. Well, this is the sum of cubes, which means it is our car bus method. So it's same, opposite, always positive. So we're going to have the same sign that we started with. So since we started off with a plus, we're going to have a plus here. Opposite would be a minus here. And then this last one is always positive. Now we have cube root, cube root. So the cubed root of x to the 3rd is x, meaning what times itself 3 times gives you x to the 3rd. And then the number of times itself 3 times that gives you 8 is 2. Then you square, multiply, square. So you square that x to get x squared. Multiply these 2 terms together to get 2x. And then you square this last term to get 4. We are finished. Moving on to the last problem of this practice test. First step is to see, is there a greatest common factor? There is not one, so now we have to see how many terms we have. There are 3 terms, so that means we're going to use our AC method. So I'm going to identify my A, B, and C. A is 1, B is negative 7, C is negative 60. So I have here x on top of my wings, negative 60 up here, and a negative 7 down here. So I need to find out what multiplies to give me negative 60 and adds to give me negative 7. So the numbers I'm going to use are 5 and 12. and the 12 will be negative. So that's a positive 5 and a negative 12. So I'm going to have x plus 5 and then x minus 12. That's it for your practice test part C. I wish you the best of luck. Make sure you remember that this is truly a practice test. This is what you will see when you look at your test in the next class. Remember that there will be 20 questions with 5 questions per page. All right, I wish you the best of luck.